Pokemon games have always been sucky. Objectively speaking, they're tedious and repetitive slogs. They rely on the imagination of the player to make them fun. I recently played Pokemon Scarlet, the fastest selling game on any Nintendo console ever, by the way, and there is enjoyment to get out of it, but it leaves a bittersweet taste in the mouth. It runs like shit, it looks like shit, the animations are for shit, it has some really weird design choices.
Well, I want to see... Oh, wow, okay. Zoom back in, please. Zoom back in.
I found myself wondering, as I always do after playing a Pokemon game, if we'll ever see a Pokemon game that realizes the full potential of the concept. But Game Freak is a business at the end of the day, and they have no monetary incentive to put any effort into realizing Pokemon's potential. The formula remains essentially unchanged from Red and Blue, and every new feature they add feels more like a lateral move than one designed to progress the formula forward. The Pokemon Company want the core to be accessible to everyone, and as a result have mushed Pokemon up until it's basically the video game equivalent of baby food. This is especially surprising considering the start of Pokemon was pretty divisive. That's what it is, segue.
When we come back, what all the fuss is about, at least to the 8-year-old set in this country.
1996, small developer Game Freak releases Pokemon Red and Green for the Game Boy in Japan. It took them 6 years to develop, and Game Freak were in constant financial trouble throughout the development. Satoshi Tajiri, just going to go over that. The head of Game Freak went without a salary so that he could pay other developers salaries. They started selling game guides and other shit on the side so that they could help fund the development. It does really well in Japan.
Almost every Japanese child knows Pocket Monsters and its star Pakucho.
And so 3 years later, Red, Blue and Yellow release worldwide, and
everyone loses their mind.
Manga, anime, toys, spin-off games, trading cards, pinball, fucking Pez, Poggers, there's fucking loads of shit. Pogs, whatever, not Poggers. Basically, it's capitalism galore.
We think that at this point we're up to about $7 billion.
The games themselves, now referred to as Gen 1, were a love it or hate it type deal. The idea of collecting 151 digital pets and using them to fight other digital pets either appealed to you or it didn't.
Ha! A Thunder Punch combined with the paralyzing attack move makes Electabuzz arguably the best all-around Pokemon in the game.
The story of Pokemon is pretty much always the same. You defeat 8 gym leaders and then the Pokemon League, all the while stomping your childhood friend into the dirt in Pokemon battles. Then you capture a god in a ball and stop an evil team from taking over the world. Sometimes these things happen in different orders, but basically every single time these things happen. Gen 1 are riddled with oddities. Some of my favourites include if an enemy Pokemon hits your Pokemon with Wrap, Bind, Fire Spin or Clamp, you literally can't do anything and just have to watch for 2 to 5 turns as your precious Pokemon gets strangled to death.
If you are playing Gen 1 Pokemon with your friends and your speed is higher than the other Pokemon and you use Gen 1 Wrap, you are a fucking pussy.
Due to a coding error, moves that are supposed to be 100% accurate actually have a 1 in 256 chance of missing.
Alright, we have a lot of outs. Got him. You have got to be kidding me!
Critical hits occur 4 times more often than they're supposed to, and this is just the surface. However, in Game Freak's defense, they had all 5 of their programmers quit on them during the development of Red and Green, leaving Junichi Masuda, the dude who was making the music, to code the rest of the game, essentially solo. Apparently he stayed up all night learning Unix.
It's a Unix system. I know this.
To be fair, with that in mind, the fact Gen 1 even functions is pretty impressive, I'll give them that. The thing that made Red, Green, Blue and Yellow so appealing was that they were oozing with charm, the adorable sprites, the cozy atmosphere, the simple, cute animations. And despite the gameplay being very repetitive and very tedious, the time spent just mashing A in battles felt like time you were actually spending training your Pokemon. Everyone knows that the hard part of learning something is just putting the time in, sitting there and forcing yourself to do the same thing over and over again until it sticks with you. It's the same with Pokemon. Practicing is boring, but at least it bonds you to your Pokemon. Obviously, Pokemon is a game, and having training your Pokemon be fun would be ideal, but for a first outing that nearly bankrupted the company, it was pretty good. I think that at the time, subconsciously, everyone thought it's boring now, sure, but there's so much potential here, and that with subsequent games, they'll find a way to make it more fun and actively engaging. Around this time, Pokemon was being criticized.
In my opinion, parents should not let their kids watch Pokemon, play Pokemon, buy Pokemon cards, have anything whatsoever to do with Pokemon, because the message is violence.
Mainly the trading card game. Kids were robbed at knife point for their Pokemon cards. One poor kid was actually stabbed over a Pokemon card. The anime was said to be cheap, violent, and a cash-in designed to brainwash kids and turn them into mindless consumers of Pokemon. It was banned in pretty much all schools around both the US and Europe.
We do not bring Pokemon cards to school. Remember that, please, fellas, because if you do...
I'll cut off your nutsack and nail it to my door! You hear me, you bastard?
But interestingly enough, only some schools in Japan banned them. I find that interesting, I don't know why. The Japanese were like able to cope with Pokemania a lot better than the rest of the world was. Most of the criticism originated in the USA. America was worried that Pokemon would turn their kids into violent, brain-dead consumers, as if America's homegrown kids' cartoons and toys weren't already doing the exact same thing as Pokemon. As one journalist puts it, the backlash, which seems largely confined to the United States, may be no more than the sound of the world's leading cultural imperialist gagging on a taste of its own medicine.
Cool.
Then in 1999, Gold and Silver, a new region to explore Johto, 100 more Pokemon, a story very similar to Gen 1, but they introduced legendary Pokemon into the mix this time, either Ho-Ho or Lugia. They added some essential features like genders, breeding, a day and night cycle, and shiny Pokemon, an incredibly rare chance to spawn Pokemon that is essentially the same as a normal Pokemon, but with different coloured sprites, the allure of which is maddeningly appealing. Ultimately, it was very similar to Gen 1. Even a review from the GBX magazine in 1999 says, "We've seen it all before." They also released Crystal, which is basically a slightly enhanced version that allows you to play as a girl and combines all the Pokemon from the two games into one. The first Pokemon movie came out. It was pretty bad, to be honest. I loved it as a kid. It was probably one of my favourite movies, but looking back, it fucking sucks. It made loads at the box office, being the most profitable Pokemon movie until Detective Pikachu came out in 2019. And then by 2001, Pokemania was a dead man walking.
It died in like a month. Like, it was huge for 2 years, and then it's like dead completely now.
The Digimon anime bumped the Pokemon anime off the #1 spot. The shelf space reserved for Pokemon products in stores had reduced significantly. Pokemon wasn't really cool in schools anymore, at least to the extent it was with like the older kids. The second movie made half of what the first movie did, and then the third movie made half of what that did. Pokemania was a kind of wave, a rogue wave, if you will. It lifted Game Freak and Pokemon up and allowed them to cruise for many years to come. 2002, Ruby and Sapphire come out for the Game Boy Advance. The graphics get a pretty big bump and introduce a few more essential features. Pokemon now have passive abilities. For example, one of the best passive abilities is Intimidate, which will automatically decrease the enemy Pokemon's attack stat by 1 stage, meaning that some of their attacks will do less damage. Pokemon now have natures like lonely, modest, timid. These natures increase one stat while decreasing another stat, like lonely, for example, which increases the attack stat of a Pokemon but lowers its defense stat. This helps give your Pokemon more personality and helps with making every Pokemon unique and introducing some further depth to the gameplay, as well as overworld weather that would impact on battles, like water moves do more damage in the rain, etc. They also introduced contests which have to do with Pokeblocks. You can look at this video here. I don't fucking understand any of it. Emerald followed another slightly enhanced version of the two games, combining all of the Pokemon. The story of Ruby and Sapphire is basically Gold and Silver, just instead of Team Rocket, it's Team Magma or Team Aqua, depending on which version you have. Team Aqua want to expand the sea, presumably until it looks like Waterworld. Team Magma want to expand the land, presumably until it looks like a super flat land in Minecraft. But after the legendary Pokemon goes on a rampage, they decide to team up to defeat it. 2004 gave us Fire Red and Leaf Green, remakes of the original but with Ruby and Sapphire graphics, some new nice areas and things like that, but basically it's red and blue. Pokemon Diamond and Pokemon Pearl released 2006 on the DS. This is where I jumped on the Pokemon train as a little old 7-year-old. The biggest change here is the battle system. Moves were now divided into physical and special. If when using a move, the Pokemon makes physical contact with the enemy, like Fire Fang does, the damage it does will be calculated using the Pokemon's attack stat. If when using a move, the Pokemon does not make physical contact with the enemy, like Hydro Pump, the damage it does will be calculated using the special attack stat. The story, as always, is pretty much unchanged, except this time Team Galactic want to use either Palkia or Dialga to create a whole new universe, somewhere that their leader can rule over, like some sort of space Hitler. The engine rendered the world in 3D, but the people and the Pokemon were 2D sprites. This gave a really nice separation between the characters and the world, and allowed for some really cool visuals, like this windmill. Diamond and Pearl did have one major drawback though. The battle system, surfing, movement, it was all painfully slow. Thankfully though, Platinum, the slightly enhanced version of Pearl and Diamond, along with Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which are Gold and Silver remakes, fixed these issues. Heart Gold and Soul Silver allowed you to have your Pokemon walk behind you, which is a feature universally loved by literally everyone on the planet, but is rarely ever seen. It also came with a Pokewalker, a pedometer you could transfer a Pokemon to from the game and walk around with it. You can like collect items and do battles and capture special Pokemon. It was apparently one of the most accurate pedometers at the time, which is pretty funny. And I recently accidentally broke mine when I left it in my trouser pocket and then washed my trousers, and I'm still crying. In terms of the core elements, Gen 4 is pretty much where Pokemon stopped evolving. Things have been added to the battle system, but they were just kind of put on top of this core system. They've never really altered the core system from here. Platinum is very good as games go. Pokemon games anyway, but it has some pacing issues in its story. Team Galactic really are not that interesting. Your rival is one of the biggest dickheads on planet Earth.
Man, this blimp's so slow, I'm finding someone for boring me to tears.
Barry, relax.
It's close to being the perfect Pokemon game, but no cigar. September 2010, Black and White, high fucking noon, what many fans, including myself, considered to be the best Pokemon game. There are some minor gripes, like some underwhelming Pokemon designs and the start of a new tradition of overly long cutscenes and dialogue boxes that feel like they just go on forever. But a good story, interesting characters, sick animations, and an actual difficulty curve makes this the best Pokemon has ever been. Team Plasma actually have an interesting goal. Instead of just some form of take over the world, they believe Pokemon should be free of their trainers, that humans shouldn't continue this barbaric practice, as they see it, of trapping creatures into a tiny ball and making them fight for their own amusement. Which is interesting because it's an idea pretty much everyone's had at some point, and like, I don't know, actually being addressed is kind of interesting. The character N is probably the most interesting character Pokemon has ever seen. Basically, he's Tarzan, but instead of being raised by wolves, he was raised by Pokemon. There's triple battles, switch battles, a great aesthetic, cool perspective moments, insanely sick idle animations, and really great cutscenes. Black and White 2 came out 2 years later, the first sequels, a different story and some different locations added on, but very similar to Black and White overall. The formula that started with Pokemon Red, Green, Blue and Yellow is finally perfected. The only reason to make another Pokemon game after Black and White and Black and White 2 would be if they had anything to change about the core way Pokemon is played, or wanted to do a drastically different story.
Blow-up dolls. That's what I see when I look at all the models. They just look up like blow-up dolls. You did less than what was there in 2D.
I don't think it's a controversial thing to say that with the jump to 3D, Pokemon lost a lot of its magic. When I first saw that Pokemon X and Y was going to be completely in 3D, I couldn't resist, even as like a 13-year-old who was developing a fairly crippling addiction to Counter-Strike.
Calma. Calma. Tá aqui um. Mas claro. Esta merda, pá. Tem que falar 500 vezes, pá!
I still wanted to play Pokemon X and Y because it was the first Pokemon game in 3D. Everyone who grew up playing Pokemon in 2D imagined how cool a 3D Pokemon game could be. It was pretty meh, to be honest. Nothing had changed about the gameplay except the fact that it was in 3D. Mega Evolutions allows your Pokemon to evolve temporarily mid-battle, giving a change in appearance and a boost in stats. Honestly, at the time, even to a 13-year-old me, this felt like more of a gimmick than anything else. It does add some complexity in battles, but only on a competitive level. For most players, it's just something cool to look at. Feels like something they did just so they could throw it in trailers and marketing and make it look like something new was happening with Pokemon. This could be because of all the mainline series games that aren't either an enhanced edition or a remake. Pokemon Black and White are the worst selling games. But hey, that's just a theory.
Okay!
X and Y also introduced a new kind of XP share. There was XP all in Gen 1. If it was in the player's bag, it would split all the XP evenly between all the Pokemon in your party. Then, from Gen 2 onwards, it was an item that could be held by a Pokemon. The Pokemon holding the item would receive half of all the XP gained, sharing it with the Pokemon that did the fainting. But starting with X and Y, the Pokemon who faints the enemy Pokemon gets full XP, and then the rest of the party receive half of that XP. This does allow the player to skip the tediousness that is training Pokemon, as all Pokemon in your party will earn enough XP to be at an appropriate level to fight. But the tediousness of training Pokemon was pretty much the only thing that bonded you to your Pokemon. Plus, it makes the game ridiculously easy. Going forward, Pokemon games kind of just become like a simulator that plays itself, requiring very little thought or even input from the player. You can turn the XP share off, but then you just return to the tediousness of training Pokemon, running around in grass for God knows how long, mindlessly destroying low-level Pokemon until you earn enough XP to level up. There's no like winning here. You either bore yourself to tears training your Pokemon manually, or you turn the XP share on and miss out on bonding with your Pokemon, which is the best part of Pokemon. This is also where Pokemon stories just become so fucking convoluted, and for lack of a better word, cringy. X and Y is something about a 3,000-year-old war and an ultimate weapon. Sounds more like Game of Thrones than anything else. Baby talk is the best way to describe dialogue going forward. The game literally treats the player like a being with the intellect of a 5-month-old. Even if I was playing these games when I was 10, I would feel like the game was talking down to me.
When I beat you, tears will fall from your eyes like Pokeballs rolling down a conveyor. Who made the dialogue in this game? Ball, 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 Pokeball, ball, ball, Ultra Ball. Who did the dialogue?
The 3D models are lifeless, static, and incredibly underwhelming. This is Pokemon Stadium 2 in 2000. And this is Pokemon Y, released in 2012. HAL Laboratories, a Nintendo Entertainment Analyst and Development, catchy name by the way, managed to make the Pokemon feel alive when they're just standing there idle. Something modern Pokemon games consistently fail to do with their 3D models. They just stand there. Menacingly! In Stadium, they've got cool poses and really energetic idle animations that you can just watch on a loop, kind of like Black and White, but in 3D. It's really sad when you're so excited to get a new Pokemon, only to have them stand there like a statue, except for when they half-heartedly throw out an arm in an attack. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire came out in 2014, Ruby and Sapphire remakes using X and Y graphics. Then in 2016, Sun and Moon came out. Sun and Moon are the worst Pokemon games in terms of dialogue. It is fucking mind-numbing. Endless dialogue boxes about shit no one gives a fuck about. The story gives off the vibe of a sitcom that does a vacation episode special, like in Extras where When the Whistle Blows goes to Spain.
They've seen it all before. They've seen everything. Every story slightly rewritten. Every character. They've seen every move used 1,000 times.
Yes, but have they seen
games in Hawaii?
An island adventure could be fun on paper, but when you realise that there's no interesting characters, a fairly boring map, an annoying Pokédex, which is always trying to talk to you, all you're left with is an ungodly amount of text boxes. And then 1 year later, they released Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, which is basically just the same game as Sun and Moon, but with more Pokemon, a slightly alternative story, and other random crap crammed in there so that you think these games are worth it when they're not. A lot of the shortfalls of Pokemon since the beginning have been how simple and fairly unengaging the gameplay is. But in 2D, your imagination did the bulk of the work. That was really cool. It meant that the thing going on in your head was much more interesting than the thing going on the screen. It asked you to create the world and the actions of the Pokemon in your head, kind of like a book does. With the jump to 3D, they destroyed this. In 3D, you don't use your imagination as much because everything is given to you. But instead of making animations and a battle system that looked and felt like what was going on in your head in the 2D versions, they kept everything the same from 2D, turning Pokemon into this cool game where monsters would fight each other in these sick fights that you pretty much created with your own creativity into a game where two monsters awkwardly stand 2 meters apart, swiping at the air. After I went through Pokemon Y, I had no interest in any other Pokemon games. It was enjoyable enough, as the concept of Pokemon games always is, but didn't do anything to make me feel like these 3D Pokemon games were worth it. It felt like Game Freak didn't care and were just making Pokemon games because they kept selling well.
Are you ready?
This is not the
This
Switch.
is the Nintendo Switch.
Breath of the Wild and the Switch came out in 2017. I didn't have a Switch, but I really wanted to play Breath of the Wild. So I got the CMU emulator, the Wii U emulator, and played through a large chunk of Breath of the Wild with 20-ish frame rate and a lot of other random issues. I eventually got a Switch, and for 2 weeks, if I wasn't at college or I wasn't at work, I was playing Zelda. It was the last time I remember being fully engrossed in a piece of media. In 2018, Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee was released. Pikachu and Eevee mark the second time that Gen 1 was remade. It's fine, I guess. The graphics were good, and it allows you to fly on Charizard's back, so 10 out of 10 really. Then Pokemon Sword and Shield was announced. Myself, and I think a lot of Pokemon fans, thought finally, the 3D Pokemon game we've all been waiting for. And after seeing what the Switch was capable of with Breath of the Wild, I naively thought, how could Game Freak possibly fuck this up? All they need to do is have graphics comparable to Breath of the Wild, create an interesting map, populate it with Pokemon, and then make a battle system that's at least slightly less boring. And then the trailer dropped, and the trailer looked like a 3DS game on steroids, and I'll be honest, a lot of my excitement left me. And then the game came out, and we all found out that it was basically just a 3DS game on steroids. There's actually a theory that it started out as a 3DS game and then they just kind of ported it over to the Switch at some point during development. Regardless, Sword and Shield proved that Game Freak weren't up to par with their contemporaries. For years, Game Freak could hide behind the fact that they were on handhelds with limited power and storage capacity. But now those limitations were lifted, and all they could do was give us a slightly higher resolution and a small open world area that is pitiful when put up against the likes of Zelda or Xenoblade or literally any other open world game that came out on the Switch. I naively was expecting Pokemon to get the Zelda treatment, reimagining this old franchise for the new generation of gaming. revamping antiquated systems while retaining the traditional look and feel of the franchise. And in hindsight, this was dumb. Zelda got that treatment because Zelda games don't really sell well unless they're really, really good games. But with Pokemon, you can take a shit on a plate, and as long as you slap a Pokemon logo on it, people eat that doo-doo up. Myself included. The battle system is unchanged, even visually, from old games. Your Pokemon still, after all this time, just stand there and throw images of bites and kicks at each other. There were some cool animations, as there always is, but they were few and far between. Even the idle animations still basically just consist of the Pokemon swaying there like they're one more bump away from an overdose. This is also where Game Freak starts to become disingenuous, for lack of a better word. The biggest controversy with Sword and Shield was the National Dex. The National Dex is basically just every single Pokemon from every single region in Pokemon, while the Regional Dex is only Pokemon from the region the game you're playing takes place in. Game Freak said the reason for this was to focus on high quality graphics and animations. They said that because they were creating 3D models for the Pokemon from scratch, it would take too much time to remake all 800 plus Pokemon. This struck people as odd because when Pokemon X and Y were data mined, it was found that the models used were far higher fidelity than anything that would be required for a 3DS game. In fact, the models were so high quality that they're a large reason why the 3DS games lag so much when you're in battles. The 3DS models were more than sufficient enough to work on a HD Switch game. So the question became, why didn't they just use the 3DS models instead of making new ones from scratch?
Basically, when they switched over from 3DS to Nintendo Switch, the frame rates are different. The quality is different. And there's actually an interview that I found that was done on a Japanese magazine in which Junichi Masuda, the director of Game Freak, he actually said that when they went to transfer some of the models and some of these move animations into Pokemon Sword and Shield, that they didn't transfer over right. And so they had to basically rebuild them from scratch.
Mm-hmm. So they had to remake the models from the ground up because of frame rate and other bugs. Except it's been proven that the models in Sword and Shield are the same models from X and Y. There are incredibly minor tweaks to some of the Pokemon, but that's it.
This is the Sword and Shield model with the Sword and Shield textures, and the triangle counts down here, 5,540, matches up with the 3DS's 5,540 triangles. And if you were to enable wireframe mode, go into the side view here and select the 3DS model, and as you can see, the Sword and Shield model is perfectly obscuring the selection of the Vaporeon model in the back, the 3DS model. And if I were to move it slightly in the back, it starts to reveal itself.
It was also found that Sword and Shield reused battle animations from X and Y. This led to the hashtag GameFreakLied trending on Twitter. Whether or not they did lie or were just really, really bad at explaining and clarifying things is unknown. Also, to complicate matters even further, from what I can tell, Game Freak don't make the Pokemon models or the animations. Creatures Inc., a part owner of the Pokemon company, have a subdivision called Pokemon CG Studio, who are responsible for the Pokemon models and animations. On Creatures' website, you can find a timeline where under Pokemon X and Y, it says developing Pokemon 3D CG modeling. So Game Freak aren't even the ones making the 3D models or the animations, meaning all they're responsible for is the world, the character models, and the story. So it's not like these elements are dog shit because Game Freak didn't have time to refine them because they were so busy with making Pokemon models and battle animations. A completely separate company with its own workforce makes and animates the models. This marks where the Pokemon community en masse really started to turn against Game Freak. Lack of innovation in Sword and Shield, coupled with a story that is possibly the most hand-holdy the series has ever seen, really started to disenfranchise fans. In 2021, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl dropped. They looked worse than Let's Go did, were incredibly buggy upon release, ridiculously easy up until the Elite Four, and just carbon copies of the original game with very little else going on, coupled with a brand new and, I'll just be nice and say questionable, art style, it didn't help to improve fans' attitude towards Game Freak. Although in their defense, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were made by Ilka. From what I can tell, Ilka mostly assist other game developers, and BDSP were the first games they made from start to finish completely by themselves, although Masuda, the Unix guy from earlier, was still game director over the title, so it's not like Game Freak are blameless. Later in 2021, Legends Arceus was announced. This was going to be a kind of spin-off game. There wouldn't be gyms or a traditional story. Instead, it's more about collecting and studying Pokemon. Legends Arceus is actually interesting. You can move around while battles are happening. Wild Pokemon will now attack you, meaning that you actually need your Pokemon to defend yourself against other Pokemon, which really helps deepen your relationships with your Pokemon, because they are literally saving you from getting your ass handed to you by like a fucking Rapidash or whatever. The battle system on a whole feels more fluid. They actually happen in the game world as opposed to being dragged to a completely separate arena. You actually throw your Pokeballs containing your Pokemon at a Pokemon that you want to engage in battle. You can craft Pokeballs and potions and other things using materials you collect in the world, along with a host of changes to the battle system. The biggest one is that once you master a move, you can choose to either use an agile version of that move or a strong version of that move. Agile means you're faster but do less damage, but you might get another chance to move before your opponent does. Strong is more powerful, but means that you might have to take 2 attacks from the enemy Pokemon before you get your next turn. That's a very basic way of describing it, but that's the gist. This adds depth for casual players, not just competitive ones. These things might sound small, and they are very small, but compared to the changes Pokemon is used to getting, this is essentially the equivalent of the invention of the wheel. However, it's not all fucking roses and daffodils and nice shit in Legends Arceus. There is also, as has become just the norm and I guess accepted, is that there's constant and endless dialogue boxes. A very sluggish and bare bones story. Really sluggish story. I cannot describe to you how sluggish I found the story. You constantly have to travel back to this one place and constantly go into this one building and constantly run up the same stairs to get to the very top to talk to the president, but only to have yourself just walk back down again. It's so pointless. The graphics, while better compared to Sword and Shield, are still lacking when compared to other games on the Switch. There's hundreds of side quests, but they're all collect X amount of thing, and like all modern Pokemon games, it's pretty easy. But overall, there was a sense of optimism from Pokemon fans. Finally, the series was changing in ways. It was actually heading in an interesting direction, and there was hope in the hearts of Pokemon fans all over the world. And fans had that hope for 10 months, and then Game Freak dropped a big old bag of fuse all over that hope.
This shit is a scam. Not even close to being worth the time and money. Graphical issues, bugs, glitches.
I don't know what the base form looks like. Cool. So yeah.
Performance in Pokemon Scarlet does seem to differ from Switch to Switch, but I can just talk about my experience, which was fucking awful. There are times where this game dips down to 15 FPS, and I'm not just talking about in cities, out in the open water and places where it's very difficult to see why it's lagging so hard. In fact, it's difficult to see why it's lagging so hard anytime, because Pokemon Scarlet and Violet looks like ass. Visually, nothing feels like it belongs together. It feels like Game Freak raided the Unity store for assets and then just kind of plonked them around willy-nilly. A lack of anti-aliasing makes everything look pixelated, making it really hard to feel like you're not playing a video game. Not that you'd want to feel immersed in a world that feels as empty and lifeless as Scarlet and Violet does. Every aspect of this game feels like it was developed in isolation, but then they just kind of threw it all together last minute, slapped box art on it, and then called it a day. Many of the changes made in Legends Arceus are gone. The battle system has gone back to the old system. You can't move around in battles. Overall, the battle system to me feels much more sluggish. Pokemon just spawn randomly in the world, often popping up directly in front of your face, leading to an unwanted battle, or are too small to even see, which leads to an unwanted battle. The smooth Legends Arceus system of Pokemon attacking you and you having to use your Pokemon to defend yourself is gone. In Legends Arceus, every Pokemon felt like they had a reason to be in the place they are, but in Scarlet and Violet, they're just kind of scattered around with no real rhyme or reason. It feels like a Game Freak developer walked up to their boss and said, "Where should we spawn the Pokemon?" The boss looked at them, just said yes, and then walked away. The story is probably the best part of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. It centers around a school where you go on adventures with other students and teachers. The basic beats are still there. You've got 8 gyms, an evil team, a rival, a legendary Pokemon. The characters, while being way too cutesy, are pretty decent, I suppose, in an anime way. You've got a computer nerd, the physical embodiment of the "how do you do fellow kids" meme, an arrogant but kind-hearted dude, and a skillful and confident rival. I read posts saying that the story made people cry by the end. While I don't think it's quite that good, it is effective. The problem is, it continues the trend of having far too many dialogue boxes. It wouldn't be so bad if the dialogue was good, but it's average at best and cringy at worst. Other open-world RPGs can have long story sequences, because they're normally fully animated voiced cutscenes, but in Pokemon Scarlet you watch bog standard anime characters stand around in an ugly world and blob like a fish at you. You can make sandwiches in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. That is all I have to say about that. It's exactly what it sounds like. You make sandwiches. They added terrestrialization. I don't care if that's how you say it. Whatever, the weird stupid hat thing. It changes your Pokemon's typing, but much like Z-moves or Mega Evolution, I imagine this is just going to be gone in the next generation in favour of a different gimmick. The discourse around this game is actually much more interesting than the game itself. On one camp, there's the ones who think it's unacceptable that Game Freak released it in this state, and that this game shows that Game Freak don't really care about their audience and are just trying to squeeze money out of them. Then there's those that seem not to mind the performance or the bugs or the fact that aesthetically, this game looks like the video game equivalent of Homer Simpson's makeup shotgun.
And now you're ready for a night on the town.
They say behind all that is a great game and a good RPG. I'd argue that the great game they're talking about underneath all the technical and the graphical issues is just Pokemon Yellow. There's a different context for the story, the map is bigger and you have a new way to navigate it, but gameplay-wise it's just Pokemon Yellow in 3D. The good game underneath could be experienced by playing any of the other previous Pokemon games. At least they run properly. Basically, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are giant piles of shit with a copy of Pokemon Yellow buried into the center of it.
That is one big pile of shit.
Game Freak, our first Easy F. They have the easiest job in the world. Just go into the office once every 3 years, Control-C, Control-V a Pokemon game, call it a day. And they can't even do that half the time.
There's a video on YouTube that goes through employees of Game Freak reviewing the company. It's linked in the description, it's a good watch. There are a few interesting points that keep coming up over and over again and help shed light on why Pokemon Scarlet and Violet is the way it is. Veteran employees supposedly refuse to learn new skills, often passing off that work to new and freelance developers. The technical capabilities are said to be several years behind the rest of the industry. New employees who are talented and who are technically capable normally quit almost immediately. There's too much privacy and it's hard to see what other departments are doing. Finally, and I think most interestingly, is apparently most people are just dickheads. Even when I went to Glassdoor, which is another similar website to the one shown in the video, both reviews mention that the people are, quote, jerks. Interestingly enough, as this commenter points out, most of the people saying it's a bad workplace culture often work on the technical side of things, while most of the comments that say it's a good workplace culture work on the design and the art side of things, which would explain why the music, the character design, and the world design have remained fairly consistently okay, but the technical side is just getting worse and worse. No one's going to do good work when there are a lot of people who are arrogant around them. This person says it's not rewarding to keep working on the same thing over and over, and I imagine this contributes to talented staff leaving and the general degradation of employee motivation. Many of the reviews indicate that Game Freak higher-ups have the attitude of it will sell well anyways.
Even if the quality is low, I think it will sell well, so I don't spend a lot of money.
I mean, they're not wrong, but it is really sad to see and to think that all the potential of Pokemon is being wasted away just because there's no monetary incentive for Game Freak to put any effort in. In every interview I read with Game Freak, they seem to have this almost begrudging attitude towards Pokemon, like when a band has that one song that is their mega hit and they've performed it so many times that they're just completely over it, and the performances of said song just keep getting more and more lifeless as the years roll on. Game Freak is split into two development teams. One is for Pokemon and the other is for the Gear project, which is where Game Freak releases their passion project games. As one Game Freak employee says, one team is fully dedicated to the Gear project while Team 2 is for the Pokemon operation. The Pokemon operation. You don't describe anything that you do with love and passion as an operation. Masuda, the Unix guy from earlier, who now works at the Pokemon company, but was very high up at Game Freak, has said while talking about the Gear project that we prioritize creating something interesting over everything else. Our philosophy is to develop games that make the world a better place, rather than ask questions like how much profit will this make, and throw out ideas because of sales projections. Ha ha ha. Creative morale would suffer. Yeah, we know that creative morale would suffer, bro, because we've literally seen it happen with Pokemon. You don't gotta tell us. Game Freak treat Pokemon like an ugly stepchild compared to the games they release through Gear Project. And when they say we want to make games that make the world a better place, I doubt that Little Town Hero, a game with mid to poor reviews, and whose peak performance on Steam was 11 active players, is gonna make the world a better place. And the irony here is that Game Freak is one of the few game developers in the whole world that could make the world a better place by developing games. Millions of people play Pokemon. It's literally the perfect platform for, quote, making the world a better place. Furthermore, they can make whatever type of game they want, and as long as it's a Pokemon game, millions of people will play it, ensuring a worldwide impact. But they use Pokemon as a cash cow, putting in minimal effort just to churn out the same product over and over again. Doing this arguably makes the world a worse place. Game Freak seem really bored with making Pokemon games, so why don't Game Freak just pass along development to another studio? This is where things get icky, because we have to talk about the Pokemon company. So Nintendo own the trademark for Pokemon, the name, the logo, things like that. But the rest of Pokemon is owned by the Pokemon Company. The Pokemon Company, in turn, is owned in equal parts by Nintendo, Game Freak, and Creatures Inc. They each own a third. But Nintendo also owns a part of both Game Freak and Creatures Inc. How much Nintendo owns, though, is unknown. So it is possible that Nintendo owns at least 51% of either Creatures or Game Freak, which would give Nintendo a majority share over the Pokemon Company as a whole. If this is true, then it could mean that really it's Nintendo calling the shots, and Nintendo are essentially using Game Freak as a slave to keep Pokemon games coming out at a consistent rate. This would explain why it feels like Game Freak are done with Pokemon, because they don't have creative control anymore and are essentially working for Nintendo in terms of Pokemon. This is all dependent on Nintendo owning at least 51% of Game Freak or Creatures though, which we don't know, and there seems to be no way of finding out unless someone from inside the company spills the beans.
Time to spill the beans. Rope.
Why'd you spill your beans?
please.
There are lots of Reddit posts that are all trying to essentially prove that they know who's to blame for the state of Pokemon. Some blame the Pokemon Company, saying they put pressure on Game Freak to release games before they're ready. Others say it's Nintendo who put pressure on Game Freak. Then others that say it's down to Game Freak themselves to decide the window. Creatures Inc. is just kind of there, to be honest with you. Game Freak have denied that anyone puts pressure on them and they decide it all themselves, but I doubt Game Freak would tell us if there was pressure put on them by anyone, not to mention Game Freak's history of not telling us the whole truth. One Redditor describes the Pokemon Company as an incestuous mess, and that seems like the best way of describing it. No one really knows who's calling the shots in terms of Pokemon, but chances are none of them really care as long as their games keep selling like Viagra at a senior citizens orgy. So we don't know why Game Freak doesn't let other developers make Pokemon games, which means I can speculate to my heart's content. I think the reason that they don't let anyone else touch the core series of Pokemon games is because they wouldn't have anything else to do. As of March 2024, Game Freak has 207 employees. The games they released through the Gear project are small games, they're indie games. They don't need that many employees for the Gear project. Without Pokemon, they would probably have to let go of a large part of their workforce. Plus, Pokemon gives them worldwide recognition, while Giga Wrecker and Little Town Hero don't. Perhaps that's all it comes down to. Game Freak enjoy the fame and the prestige that comes with being the Pokemon developers. Game Freak is run by people at the end of the day with egos.
He called Bulbasaur.
That's Onion Turtle.
Geodude.
Punchy Rock.
Meowth.
That cat with them long ass arms.
The Pokemon community, for the most part, is made up of cool people, but there is a corner that is smoking some nuclear grade copium. And then there's another corner that just wants to shit on Pokemon for the sake of shitting on it.
It's no good.
I remember reading this thing once in a book. I can't find the book, so I can't quote it. But basically it said that a film doesn't happen on the screen. It's not in the frames or the music or the sound. It happens in your head. The film is just a guideline to help your imagination. I think it's the same for games. It's the reason we can all play the same game, but come away with vastly different opinions. Because games don't happen on the screen, they happen in your head. Pokemon as a core concept is so creative and alluring that just hearing the concept is enough to get your own imagination started, let alone with a game as a guideline for it. It doesn't matter how bad the game is, how poorly it runs, how lackluster the story is, or how easy the gameplay is. It'll stir your imagination because the core concept is so strong. And that's a great thing, but it doesn't make any of these Pokemon games good games. Even going all the way back to Pokemon Yellow, you've got boring gameplay, lackluster story, and bugs everywhere. The game being bad can't take away from your enjoyment, and just because you enjoy playing a game doesn't mean it's good. Pokemon's core concept is so strong that even a shitty game like Scarlet and Violet can stimulate your imagination. So imagine how high and how far your imagination could soar if it had a decent game to use as a guideline. Game Freak are denying the world a very beautiful thing because they're too lazy or too incompetent to make a game worthy of a genius concept. And what's worse is they're too arrogant or they're too possessive to let anyone else try. Plus, in my opinion, they make people look like idiots for enjoying these games. When you release such buggy, messy, ugly, incomplete, and empty games, it really shows a lack of respect for your audience. While the toxic part of the Pokemon community isn't Game Freak's fault, they certainly don't help fans that do enjoy and stand by these games by releasing messes like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. When Scarlet and Violet first came out, Twitter was having a great time dunking on the game because it was such an easy target, and by extension, so were the fans of the game. From Software are very similar to Game Freak. Like Game Freak, they've pretty much been making the same game for years now, and like Pokemon, they recently went from a linear open world to a fully open world. The difference is that From Software respects your time and your ability. It's clear that every corner of From Software games are carefully thought about and fleshed out with an incredible amount of love, passion, and care, whereas every corner of Pokemon Scarlet feels horridly slapped together until it gets to the point of being just about functionable. From Software ensures that their games are rewarding by making them challenging and forcing you to really discipline yourself in order to beat them. Pokemon holds your hand and literally just tells you which move to use by labeling your moves super effective to not very effective. True that Pokemon is for kids, but Minecraft and Breath of the Wild are some of the best and the most popular kids games, and neither of them feel the need to treat the player like a baby. The ones in the Pokemon community who say that people should stop complaining about Scarlet and Violet's graphical and technical issues and just enjoy the game, I feel are really missing the point. It's not that the games aren't fun, it's that they have so much untapped potential, and the untapped potential keeps growing in size the more they move on to more advanced hardware, and yet simply don't utilize that more advanced hardware to do new and interesting things. I think most of the people complaining do find enjoyment in these modern Pokemon games. It's hard to not have at least some fun when there's a Charizard in your pocket, but for 20 years now, Pokemon fans have been saying the same thing. These games are all the same, each game feels like a copy-paste of the previous game with a different gimmick thrown in so that we just think it's a different game. The biggest change they've made is going from 2D to 3D, but going from 2D to 3D takes a lot of talent and a good work ethic, and Game Freak seemingly lacks both of those things. So the jump to 2D to 3D just did more damage than good. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet's technical and graphical issues are just the straws that broke the camel's back for many people. 12 years of cutting every single corner imaginable, zero innovation, and being generations behind the rest of the industry is really the problem. What's worse is there's no excuse for Pokemon's untapped potential. It's not like Game Freak lack for money to hire talented staff, and lots of them. It's not like the hardware is holding them back. Breath of the Wild and Xenoblade and countless other Switch games prove that. From the outside looking in, it appears there's really no good reason for this untapped potential other than either incompetence or lack of shits to give from Game Freak's side. Graphically, From Software games are lagging behind the rest of the industry, technically speaking anyway, and like Pokemon, they reuse a lot of assets, but just like Breath of the Wild, they make up for it in a myriad of ways. Unique art style and world design, great use of lighting and shadows, impeccable placement of objects in the game world. Pokemon does none of these things. Like Pokemon, From Software tells most of its stories through text, but they keep it short and sweet, always keeping you wanting to find out more, instead of Pokemon's constant bombardment of text boxes. Like Pokemon, the gameplay loop has remained the same, but unlike Pokemon, they're constantly upping the ante. Comparing a Dark Souls 2 boss to an Elden Ring boss is night and day, but Pokemon X and Y compared to Pokemon Scarlet is the exact same, except for a higher resolution. From Software takes their limitations and turns them into strengths, whereas Game Freak doubles down on their limitations and puts them front and center. That's why, to me, it's so confusing that people defend these modern Pokemon games. Game Freak treat them like shit, and yet some people still stand by them. I understand having fun with the games. Like I said, I think most of the people complaining do find some fun in them like I do. But defending them as good games is very strange to me. People seem to have attached a part of their personality to Pokemon games, and by extension, Game Freak. It's like they think they owe Game Freak something. Like Game Freak are responsible for the things that went on inside their head when they were a kid playing their first Pokemon game. If it wasn't Pokemon that ignited that feeling and that imagination, it would have just been something else. It wasn't the games that were good. Your imagination was good. The games were average at best and tedious at worst. The enjoyment doesn't come from Game Freak. Game Freak are just subpar developers making subpar games that have an insanely gripping and potential-filled concept. The more people treat Game Freak like what they are, the more I think Game Freak would be inclined to get off their asses and make games that match the level of their contemporaries. Because there's no way of stopping the Pokemon money train, so there's never going to be any monetary incentive for Game Freak to give a shit. So we might as well try and shame them into making a decent game. Pokemon is a victim of its own success. Game Freak are content to just rest on their laurels and sit back, count their money. Their relationship with their community is more reminiscent of an abusive spouse than one between a game developer and the fans of their games. Once the honeymoon phase was over with Black and White, Game Freak weren't really interested in putting in effort anymore, continually falling down a spiral of laziness, making half-hearted attempts at changing, promising things will be different in order to keep drawing their audience back in, only for their audience to find out that nothing has changed except a new, sloppily applied coat of paint. Chances are we won't see a decent Pokemon game until the old guard at Game Freak leave, and even then, with the bad workplace culture that they've seemingly cultivated, it likely means that whoever takes their place will be just as uninterested in realizing Pokemon's potential. As employees say, talented staff leave pretty much immediately, and the only ones who see promotions are the ones who suck the boss's dicks. Pokemon Games' future seems bleak and depressing unless some divine act of God intervenes and development of Pokemon games is somehow taken away from Game Freak. The forecast for Pokemon fans is the same as it's been since 2013. Disappointment. Game Freak's Gear Project department is working on a samurai action game. All we have is this screenshot. It's called Project Bloom at the moment, and it looks pretty cool based on this one screenshot. Maybe Project Bloom will be the hit that the Gear Project has been waiting for, so that Game Freak will finally be known for something other than Pokemon, but we'll just have to wait and see. Pokemon Legends ZA is set to come out in 2025. We know very little about it other than it takes place in Lumino City, which is the city from Pokemon X and Y. It's going to have Mega Evolutions in it. Hopefully, like the previous Legends game, Legends ZA is an actual step in the right direction, but we'll just have to wait and see. I do hope it is, and I hope that Pokemon finally reveals some of this potential that it's had locked away since the fucking 90s. That's pretty much where Pokemon is at. I mean, it really doesn't seem like it's going anywhere other than in circles. Thanks for watching. See you later. Have a good day. Blah, 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 etc., etc.
What's that Pokemon? Drifloon, the balloon Pokemon, a ghost and flying type. Drifloon grabbed children's hands as if they were going to guide them to the ghost world.